They said no one ever came willingly to Stefan Kessler's door. Not debtors, not police, not even the most reckless men in the Northeast. His name was a warning. The mansion he lived in on Beacon Hill was territory the entire Boston underworld knew by heart. If you stepped inside without an invitation, you shouldn't expect to step back out. But on the coldest night of winter in the past 20 years, when hail hammered against car windows like buckshot, and the brutal cold drove every living thing to curl inward and hide in darkness, the mansion's security cameras captured something no one in the organization could explain. A gaunt woman staggered through the iron gate, left hanging slightly open. Dark brown hair was plastered across her face. Dried blood marked her forehead. One hand clung to the slate gray coat of the massive beast beside her, a Neapolitan Mastiff the size of a calf, wounded, bleeding, yet still moving, still dragging its body forward, as if it understood that stopping meant death for both of them. Then she collapsed, right at the stone steps, as though that was the final destination her strength could still reach. The dog didn't leave. It lowered itself beside her, pressing its body against hers, shielding her with everything it had left. Then it lifted its head and stared straight into the camera, its clouded eyes still fierce, as if it were saying, "If you want to touch her, you'll have to step over my corpse first." Jonas Brandt, Stefan's right hand, was the first to see it. He zoomed in on the screen, paused for 2 seconds, then called his boss. Stefan was sitting in his study, dried blood still staining his wrist from tonight's settlement, his glass of whiskey untouched. He looked at the screen Jonas held out to him. He didn't look at the woman. He looked at the dog. He looked at the way it lay there, wounded, dying, but still shielding the one under its care with the last scraps of strength in its body. And somewhere inside Stefan Kessler's mind, something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just the image of a Rottweiler tied to a wooden post in the back courtyard of the mansion 28 years ago, looking at him one last time before his father's gunshot split the air. Nero, he'd never forgotten those eyes. And tonight, those eyes were looking at him again, through another dog, at his front door, in the middle of a hailstorm. Stefan set his glass down. He stood. He walked out into the freezing night without a coat. He knelt beside the steps. The dog growled, weak, desperate, but still growled. Stefan didn't move back. He held out his hand, palm up, and waited. The dog looked at him. Then it lowered its head. A drop of blood from the wound in its side fell onto Stefan's hand. "Warm," he said to Jonas, his voice as flat as black water at midnight. "Bring them both inside." Jonas didn't ask why. After 20 years with Stefan Kessler, he knew when his boss was giving an order and when his boss was begging, even if the two sounded exactly the same. The woman was carried across the threshold. The dog was lifted on a $3,000 cashmere blanket. Stefan tore off the sofa without blinking. Before she lost consciousness completely, she whispered in a shattered voice that was still terrifyingly clear. "The backpack. Don't lose it. The backpack. Not the dog. Not thank you. Not a plea for mercy. The backpack." Stefan looked at the dying woman in Jonas's arms, then at the old blood-stained backpack hanging from her shoulders, and he understood, in that moment, before he even knew her name, before he knew what she was carrying, that this woman wasn't running. She was making a move in a chess game, and she had just placed her piece on his board. That night, Stefan Kessler didn't sleep. Not because of business, not because of enemies, but because for the first time in 28 years, he sat on the kitchen floor of his own house, watching a dying dog breathe, and he wanted it to live. The story has only just begun. If you want to know who that mysterious woman is, what was inside the backpack, and whether that dying dog survives, hit like so I'll know you want to hear more. Share this video with a friend who loves heavy-hearted stories too. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, this is the moment. Hit subscribe, and I'll tell you the next part. The next morning, weak sunlight slipped through the curtains of the Beacon Hill mansion, but Stefan hadn't slept. He was still there on the cold kitchen floor, his back resting against the oak cabinets, his eyes fixed on the slow rise and fall of the dog's chest beside the fireplace. Goliath lay on the $3,000 cashmere blanket, now soaked through with dried blood, his wrinkled slate gray coat clumped and matted, the stab wound in his flank still seeping through the temporary bandage Jonas had wrapped around it at midnight. The veterinarian arrived at 6 in the morning. A salt and pepper-haired man named Harrison, the one Stefan kept for cases he didn't want anyone to know about, carried his medical case into the kitchen, looked at the enormous Neapolitan Mastiff stretched out on the floor, then looked at Stefan sitting beside him and didn't ask a single unnecessary question. He dropped to one knee, cut away the old bandage, and examined the wound. The blade had gone in deep, less than an inch from the spleen, but it hadn't struck it. Whether that was luck or a miracle, no one knew. Harrison prepared the needle and sutures. The moment his hand touched Goliath's skin, the dog let out a weak growl and tried to lift his head. Stefan placed his hand on the dog's neck and pressed gently. Goliath looked at him, then lowered his head again, as though knowing Stefan was there was enough. Just as Harrison began the first stitch, the sound of unsteady footsteps echoed in the hallway. Marin appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face drained of color, one hand clutching the frame, her body swaying as if she were about to collapse again. She didn't look at Stefan. She didn't look at Jonas standing behind him. Her eyes locked straight onto the wound in Goliath's side, and the doctor's hands stitching it closed. Then she spoke, her voice hoarse but so clear that the whole kitchen fell silent. The blade missed the spleen. Close it in 3 layers. Use dissolvable sutures for the inner layer. Interrupted stitches for the middle, 1/2 inch apart. Continuous stitching for the outer layer. But don't pull too tight. Mastiff skin necroses easily if the blood supply is cut off. Harrison lifted his head and looked at her. It wasn't the look of ordinary surprise. It was the look of one professional recognizing another. He nodded and did exactly as she said. Marin stood there for 10 more seconds, her eyes following every movement of the needle, and then her legs gave way. Jonas stepped forward to catch her, but she fainted before she hit the floor. Stefan didn't rise. Not because he was cold, but because his hand was still resting on Goliath's neck and the dog was trembling, and he knew that if he moved away now, Harrison wouldn't be able to finish stitching him up. But he looked at the unconscious woman in Jonas's arms, and in his mind there was only one thought. She had just fainted for the 2nd time, in less than 12 hours. Her body was failing. No one had even wiped the dried blood from her forehead, and the first thing she did when she opened her eyes wasn't cry out in pain, wasn't ask where she was, but save the dog. This wasn't an ordinary victim. This was someone who knew how to keep what she loved alive, even while she herself was dying. And that thought dragged Stefan back to a place he never wanted to return to. The backyard of the old mansion in Brookline. Autumn. Yellow leaves blanketing the grass. Stefan at 9 years old, standing by the wooden fence, watching Nero tied to an iron post in the middle of the yard. The Rottweiler's coat was sleek black, his ears folded, his brown eyes warm, his tail still wagging when he saw Stefan, even though the rope around his neck was already pulled tight enough to choke him. His father stood behind him. Helmut Kessler, tall, broad, blonde hair slicked back, a face carved out of stone. Beside him stood one of the family gunmen, a pistol already loaded. Helmut didn't look at the dog. He looked at his son. If you want to be strong, you have to know how to lose. A Kessler doesn't keep weak things. Stefan didn't understand. How could a 9-year-old understand? Nero was his only friend, the only thing in that cold house that knew how to wag its tail when it saw him. He looked at his father, looked at Nero, looked at the gun. Then came the shot. Not as loud as he had imagined. Just one dry crack, like someone slamming a hand down onto a wooden table. Nero jerked. His front legs buckled. Then he fell sideways. His tail wagged one more time. Then it stopped. Stefan stood frozen. Not because he was brave. Because he had forgotten how to move. His legs didn't obey him. His arms hung at his sides like 2 dead things that didn't belong to him. His eyes were open, but he saw nothing except the sleek black coat lying still on the yellow grass. Helmut patted him on the shoulder. Good. A Kessler doesn't cry. Stefan didn't cry. Not that day. Not the day after. Not ever. But that night, after the whole house was asleep, he crept down into the yard and found Nero's leather collar, the one the gunman had removed and tossed beside the trash bin. He carried it back to his room, lay down on the floor, held the collar that still smelled of dog fur, and made himself a vow he kept for the next 28 years. Never hold on to anything that can be taken from you. Never let anyone see what matters to you, because anything that matters will be tied to a post and shot. The sound of Harrison setting his scissors down on the steel tray pulled Stefan back to the present. Done. The wound was clean, stitched in 3 layers exactly as the woman had said before she fainted. Goliath was breathing more evenly now, deeper now, his wrinkled belly rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. He was past the worst of it. Stefan stood up. His legs were numb from sitting too long on the stone floor. He looked at Goliath, looked at the fresh seam on the dog's flank, the black thread crossing over slate-gray skin. Then he looked toward the living room where Jonas had laid Maren on the sofa, a blanket tucked up to her chin, her face in unconsciousness so peaceful it looked false, as if no one had ever driven a knife into her dog's side to punish her. Stefan stepped into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and set it on the table beside Maren's sofa. She didn't know. She was unconscious, but he set it there anyway. Then he returned to the corner of the kitchen, stood in the same place as before, both hands shoved deep into his pockets, and watched Goliath breathe. His fists were clenched so tightly inside those pockets that his knuckles turned white, because inside the coat hanging in the hallway, in the smallest hidden pocket no one knew about, there was still an old leather collar, worn thin, frayed, its scent long since faded away. 28 years, and he still carried it with him. Maren opened her eyes in the late afternoon. The sunlight had turned a pale shade of orange as it filtered through the living room curtains, and the first thing she heard wasn't a human voice, wasn't machinery, but breathing. Heavy, slow, steady. Goliath. She knew that sound before her vision had even come into focus. After 5 years of sleeping beside that dog, she knew the rhythm of his breathing the way she knew the rhythm of her own heart. He was alive. That breath told her more than any words of reassurance ever could. But the first thing Maren said as she tried to push herself up on the unfamiliar sofa wasn't, "Is he okay?" Or, "Where am I?" She said, her voice rough and scraped raw, her eyes sweeping across the room as if searching for something very specific. "Where's the backpack?" Jonas turned from the window and looked at her. Stefan stood in the kitchen doorway, a cup of coffee in his hand that had long since gone cold, and he didn't answer right away. He watched. This woman had fainted twice in less than a day. Her body was covered in bruises. Her forehead still held a streak of dried blood no one had fully cleaned away. And the first thing she thought of when she opened her eyes wasn't herself, wasn't the dog breathing right at the foot of the sofa, but the backpack. Jonas looked at Stefan, waiting for the order. Stefan gave the slightest nod. Jonas brought the old blood-stained backpack in from the hall and set it beside Maren. She lunged for it with both trembling hands and clutched it to her chest like a child. Then she opened the zipper and checked what was inside. A small black flash drive sealed in a zip bag. A palm-sized hardcover notebook with worn edges, its pages crowded with tiny handwritten notes, and an old photograph, yellowed with age, showing 2 16-year-old girls standing in front of a weather-beaten gray wooden house, grinning wide, one arm slung around the other's shoulders. Maren looked at the photograph longer than she looked at the other two things. Her fingers brushed across the face of the girl standing beside her in the picture, and then she slipped the photo back inside, carefully, as if she were afraid it might break. She lifted her head and looked at Stefan. He was still standing in the doorway, not coming any closer, not asking a question, just watching, and she began to tell him, not quickly. Each word came slowly, heavy as stone, as though every sentence had to be lifted from somewhere deep inside her before it could be set down in the light. Wade Pollard. His name left her mouth like a shard of glass. She met him when she was 22, fresh out of foster care, alone, with no family, no address to return to. She worked as a nurse at a small clinic in Dorchester, earning just enough to pay for a damp rented room and buy food for Goliath, the dog she had found near a garbage heap when he was only a few weeks old, tiny and trembling inside a wet cardboard box. Wade came into the clinic one night with a knife wound in his arm, smiling with a charm that knew exactly what a lonely woman wanted to hear. 3 months later, she moved into his house. 6 months later, she was no longer allowed to go outside alone. A year later, she had forgotten what it felt like to open a door without asking permission. 5 years. Maren said the number in a flat voice, as though she were reading test results from somebody else's chart. 5 years of being beaten, caged, locked inside an apartment whose windows had been sealed with iron bars. He didn't drink. He didn't use drugs. He beat her while sober, while calm, while smiling. That was the most frightening part, Maren said. He never lost control. He knew exactly what he was doing. Goliath was the only thing Wade didn't touch, because the dog was too large and Wade didn't want to be bitten. But the night Maren tried to run, when she opened the back door and pulled Goliath with her, Wade was already standing there on the back steps. He didn't hit her that time. He pulled out a knife and drove it straight into the dog's flank. "If you want to leave, then leave," he said. "But he stays." Maren didn't go. She dropped to her knees and held Goliath as he bled across the back steps, and she knew she would never leave him behind. But she also knew that the next escape would have to be the last one. She began to prepare. The flash drive, she told Stefan, held evidence of Wade's illegal transactions through the port of Boston. She had found it in the drawer of his desk. The notebook contained shipping codes she had copied down while Wade wasn't home. She said the words found and copied down while looking straight ahead without blinking, her voice level, too level. Stefan listened from beginning to end. He didn't interrupt. He didn't nod. Nothing moved across his face, but inside his mind, one small detail caught and held like a splinter. Port shipping codes. He knew what those looked like because his own organization used the port too. Strings of mixed numbers and letters, changing by season, by route, by type of cargo. Not the kind of thing left lying in a drawer. Not the kind of thing an outsider could simply copy down and understand. To know which code matched which shipment, you had to be inside the system. You had to be part of it. Stefan looked at Maren. She looked back at him. And in that moment, both of them knew the other was hiding something. But Stefan didn't ask. Not yet. Because just then Goliath shifted at the foot of the sofa and let out a soft whine, and Maren immediately bent down, her hand moving to the dog's head, her eyes softening completely, and Stefan saw what he needed to see. Whatever she was hiding, the love she felt for this dog wasn't something that could be faked. Stefan's phone vibrated. Katrin's name lit the screen. He stepped into the hallway to answer. His sister's voice wasn't cold. Her voice had the clinical precision of a scalpel. Jonas just told me. You brought a strange woman connected to Wade Pollard into our house, into the main mansion, the place with the system, the records, everything we spent 10 years building. Have you lost your mind? Stefan didn't answer right away. He looked through the crack in the doorway into the living room. Maren was lying on her side on the sofa, one hand hanging down to rest on Goliath's head, her eyes closed, her lips moving as she murmured something to the dog that he couldn't quite hear. Are you listening to me? Katrin asked again, her voice rising. I am, Stefan said. But she stays. Silence on the other end of the line. Then Katrin spoke, slow and clear. If she's Wade's trap, you'll lose more than a house. Stefan ended the call. He knew Katrin was right. He knew every survival instinct honed over 20 years in the underworld was screaming that this risk wasn't worth it. But he knew something else too. Something he couldn't put into words because he had never learned how to speak this kind of truth. The night before, when he sat on the kitchen floor watching the dog breathe, for the first time in 28 years, he wanted something to stay alive. 2 days passed inside the Beacon Hill mansion like 2 weeks. Goliath had managed to stand again, all 4 legs trembling, but standing, the stitches along his flank pulling his skin tight each time he moved. He walked from the kitchen to the living room and back again, slow and heavy, like an old man learning to walk after a stroke. But he wouldn't eat. Harrison called every morning to check on him, and by the second day he told Stefan plainly that this was trauma, stress, that the dog was shutting his body down, and that if he didn't eat within another 48 hours, things would turn bad quickly, and bad in the kind of way that didn't come back. Jonas tried first. He set a bowl of ground beef in front of Goliath's muzzle, sat beside him, and waited. The dog looked at the food as if it were something that had nothing to do with him, then turned his face away. Jonas tried 3 times, with 3 different kinds of food, and each time got back that same empty stare. Then Maren tried. She sat down on the kitchen floor beside Goliath, placed the food in her hand, held it close to his muzzle, and softly called his name the way she had called it for the past 5 years. Goliath licked her hand once, then lay down again, his eyes open but fixed on nothing, those clouded eyes as if there were nothing left behind them worth seeing. Maren sat beside him for more than an hour, her hand stroking the wrinkled fur along his neck, and when she finally stood and walked out of the kitchen, her eyes were red but dry. She had cried enough already. What remained was fear, the silent fear of someone about to lose the last thing she still had left to keep. That evening, Stefan passed the kitchen on his way down from the study to the lower floor. He hadn't meant to stop. There was no reason to. Jonas had already reported the situation. He already knew the dog wouldn't eat. He had nodded and said to keep monitoring him. That was the response of a boss. Reasonable, measured, emotionally untouched. But when he stepped past the kitchen doorway, Goliath lifted his head. For the first time in 2 days, the dog lifted his head, not because he heard footsteps, because Jonas and Maren had gone in and out of the kitchen a dozen times and he hadn't reacted once. He lifted his head because he recognized the person passing by. Those clouded eyes looked straight at Stefan, waiting. Stefan stopped in the middle of his step, looked down. The dog looked up. No growl, no wagging tail, just that look, with the same expression Stefan had seen only once in his life, 28 years ago, on the face of a Rottweiler tied to a post. He didn't know when he made the decision. He only knew that a second later he was sitting on the cold kitchen floor, his back against the cabinet, his legs stretched out, saying nothing. Goliath watched him for a few more seconds, then the dog crawled over, slow, laboring, the stitches in his side pulling so tight that a faint whine slipped out of him. He crawled until his huge, wrinkled muzzle came to rest on Stefan's thigh, heavy, warm, and completely trusting. Stefan didn't move. Jonas appeared in the kitchen doorway, about to say something, but Stefan stopped him with a glance. Jonas disappeared. Then Stefan did something he couldn't have explained even to himself. He reached for the bowl of food Maren had left on the floor, scooped a little onto his fingers, and held it out in front of Goliath's muzzle. The dog sniffed, then ate, from Stefan's hand. Slowly, one small bite at a time, as if the food mattered less than the hand offering it. Goliath ate half the bowl, then stopped, his muzzle still resting on Stefan's thigh. His eyes closed now, his breathing even. Maren was standing outside the kitchen door. No one knew how long she had been there. She looked at the scene before her, the most powerful man in the Northeast sitting on his own kitchen floor feeding an injured dog from his hand, and she understood something that didn't need to be spoken aloud. The dog had chosen. Not chosen an owner, because Goliath had only one owner, and that was her. He had chosen the person he trusted, the person whom, for some reason, by that ancient instinct dogs had carried for thousands of years, he had recognized as safe. Maren stepped back from the kitchen door without a sound. She didn't want to break whatever was happening in that room. Night fell. Stefan was still sitting on the kitchen floor, Goliath asleep across his lap, and he didn't get up. The phone vibrated on the table. Jonas brought it over. A message from an unknown number, sent to the phone of a low-level employee in the organization. Attached was a video. Stefan opened it. The small screen showed an apartment on fire. Flames licked across a window frame sealed with welded bars, swallowing the curtains, swallowing the walls, swallowing everything inside. Maren's old apartment in Dorchester. He burned it down. Then the voice message played, the voice of a man so calm it was frightening, not shouting, not making loud threats, only speaking as if he were giving a weather report. I burned the house. Next, I burned the person. Stefan watched the video to the end. His face showed nothing. No furrowed brow, no clenched jaw, no reaction an ordinary man might have when hearing a threat to kill someone. But his hand, the one stroking behind Goliath's ear, stopped. The dog opened his eyes and looked up because the warm hand was no longer moving. Stefan looked at Jonas. His voice carried the absolute stillness of a predator. The tone Jonas knew better than anyone was the most dangerous of all. Get Katrin to Boston. We have work to do. On the fourth night since Maren had crossed the gates of the Beacon Hill mansion, Wade Pollard made his move. No warning. No negotiation. No second threatening phone call. Because with Wade, the video of the apartment burning had been the last thing he needed to say. Everything after that was action. Stefan was on the second floor when it began. He had just ended a call with Katrin. His sister was on her way from New York and would arrive the next morning, when the mansion's security system went dark. All of it. Cameras, motion sensors, the electronic locks on the main gate, the floodlights in the yard. Everything died in the same second, as if someone had pulled the plug on the entire house. Stefan knew immediately. It wasn't a power outage. It wasn't a system malfunction. Someone had shut it down from inside. He pulled his gun from the drawer of his desk, the Beretta he always kept within reach, and before he could even step out of the room, the sound of shattering glass downstairs ripped through the silence. Not one crash, several at once. The living room windows, the kitchen windows, the back door, as if the house were being hit from every direction. Then came the gunfire. The sound of bullets exploding through the marble hallways rolled like thunder through a cave, each shot multiplied threefold by stone walls and high ceilings. Jonas was downstairs. Stefan heard him fire twice, then heard someone scream. Someone who wasn't Jonas. Then 3 more shots in quick succession. Stefan ran for the staircase. Darkness and bursts of muzzle flash cut across each other. He saw 2 figures coming up the stairs. faces covered, guns raised. He fired. The first shot hit the man in front in the chest, sending him crashing backward into the one behind him. The second hit the second man in the shoulder, and he tumbled down the steps with a ragged cry. But there were more footsteps below. More than two. Stefan looked down over the stair, railing into the first-floor hallway, and saw Jonas braced against the wall near the bathroom door, his left hand pressed against his right shoulder, blood spilling through his fingers. A bullet had torn through Jonas's shoulder from behind, from the direction of the kitchen, where no one should have been able to get in if the security system had still been running. The traitor was in the kitchen. Stefan understood that in less than a second, but he had no time to deal with it, because the sound of Marin's bedroom door being smashed open exploded at the far end of the second-floor hallway. The room where he had put her, along with Goliath. The door flew inward. A dark figure rushed in, and Goliath rushed out. The 60-kilogram Neapolitan Mastiff slammed straight into the intruder's chest with the full force of his body. He didn't bite. He didn't need to. Gravity and mass did the rest. The man crashed onto his back on the floor, his head striking the wall, his gun flying from his hand. Goliath stood over his chest, all four legs planted, his jowls hanging open, saliva dripping onto the face of the man pinned beneath him. He didn't growl. He just stood there, but the stitches along his flank tore open. Fresh blood soaked through the white bandage, ran down the folds of his wrinkled belly, and dripped in steady drops onto the chest of the man beneath him. Marin appeared behind Goliath, terror in her eyes but nothing in her hands. She saw Jonas downstairs through the stair railing, saw the blood on his shoulder, and ran to him. With gunfire still cracking in scattered bursts, with the air thick from gunpowder and plaster dust, Marin dragged Jonas into the first-floor bathroom, slammed the door shut, and locked it. She tore bath towels into long strips, yanked the leather belt from Jonas's trousers, wrapped it around his shoulder, and pulled it tight to compress the wound. Jonas groaned, his face drained white, his eyes starting to lose focus. Marin slapped his cheek lightly. "Look at me. Breathe. Don't close your eyes." Her voice didn't shake. It was the voice of a nurse used to blood, used to bodies shutting down, used to keeping other people alive while everything around her collapsed. Jonas looked at her, fighting to focus, and gave the smallest nod. Upstairs, Stefan heard more footsteps coming through the front entrance. More men. Wade wasn't sparing bodies. He counted fast in his head. 2 down on the stairs, 1 pinned under Goliath. Jonas had taken down at least 1 downstairs, but there were still more, and he had only 4 bullets left. In 20 years in the underworld, Stefan had never once given the order to retreat. Never. This house was territory. It was a symbol. It was 10 years of building compressed into every slab of marble and every bulletproof wall. To abandon it would mean admitting defeat, but downstairs, Jonas was bleeding in the bathroom, while Marin fought to keep him alive. At the far end of the second-floor hall, Goliath was standing over the intruder with his stitches torn open and blood still pouring from his side, and Stefan Kessler, for the first time in his life, chose people instead of territory. "Fall back," he said into the radio. His words were as cold and unyielding as iron. "Basement tunnel. Backup car. Now." The basement tunnel led out to the alley behind the mansion, where a black SUV had been parked since the day Stefan bought the house. The key always in the ignition, the gas tank always full. That was the rule for people who lived in a world where death could knock at the door at any moment. Always keep an exit no one knows about. Stefan went down first, sweeping the passage quickly with the flashlight mounted beneath the barrel of his gun, then gave a short whistle to signal it was clear. Marin helped Jonas down behind him, his arms slung over her shoulders, his feet dragging against the concrete steps, blood from the wound through his shoulder still seeping through the makeshift bandage of torn towels. Goliath came last, moving slowly, all 4 heavy legs taking each step down into the dark stairwell with care, the torn stitches in his flank, leaving a streak of blood on every step behind him. Once they were all inside the vehicle, Stefan started the engine and drove into the alley with the headlights off. Above them, inside the mansion, the gunfire had stopped. In its place came the smell of smoke. Stefan looked in the rearview mirror just in time to see the first flames burst from a first-floor window. Wade had set it on fire. Exactly his style. Not take it, burn it. Just like Marin's apartment in Dorchester. Just like the video he had sent 2 days earlier. Wade Pollard didn't take what belonged to other people. He burned it to the ground so no one would have anything left to return to. Orange flames licked up over the gray stone roof in the mirror, and Stefan watched 10 years of building his life turn into ash as the distance between them widened. Every slab of marble he had chosen, every wall he had reinforced, every security system he had paid the best people to design, all of it was burning. And the traitor, the employee who had shut the system down from the inside, was probably standing somewhere outside watching the fire, with Wade's money tucked into his coat. Stefan clenched his jaw until his temples throbbed, but he didn't speak. He didn't look in the mirror again. He turned his eyes back to the road, pressed harder on the gas, and drove. The back seat was a picture no painter would ever want to put on canvas. Jonas lay on his side, his head leaning against the car door, his face so white that his lips were nearly the same color as his skin, his eyes open but unfocused, his breathing shallow and fast. Maren sat in the middle. Her lap served as a pillow for Goliath's head. The dog curled across a seat far too small for his 60-kilogram body, his 4 legs hanging over the edge, the torn wound in his flank soaking through the bandage. Maren's left hand pressed against Goliath's injury, holding the cloth tight to stop the bleeding. Her right hand gripped Jonas's wrist, her fingers resting exactly where his pulse beat, keeping him awake while tracking his heart rate with the professional instinct that had sunk all the way into bone. Blood was everywhere on her hands, on her thighs, on the collar of her shirt, on her face. Goliath's blood, Jonas's blood, and her own from the cut along her arm that she didn't even remember getting, probably from running past broken glass in the hallway. 3 kinds of blood had become one, and Maren didn't care to separate them. She was only holding on, holding the dog's wound shut, holding Jonas's pulse beneath her fingers, holding everything together with 2 small hands covered in blood. No one spoke in the car, not one word. There was only the heavy sound of Goliath breathing, each slow rise and fall beneath Maren's hand, the faint groan Jonas made whenever the SUV hit a pothole, that fragile sound from the throat of a man trying not to pass out. The windshield wipers moving back and forth in steady rhythm as rain began to fall. The cold, early winter rain Boston always seemed to reserve for its worst nights. And the sound of the engine, even, low, constant, like the only heartbeat still steady in the middle of everything breaking apart. Stefan drove on instinct, both hands on the wheel, eyes straight ahead. No GPS, because GPS could be tracked. No phone, because phones could be located. Only memory and the road he had driven 3 times over the past 10 years for a situation exactly like this one. Interstate 90 West, then north onto Interstate 91, through New Hampshire, into Vermont. 4 hours of driving, 4 hours of silence. At the 40th minute, Stefan looked into the rearview mirror, not at the road behind him, at Maren. She was already looking back at him. Her eyes were open, bright, dry. Her hands were soaked in blood, but they didn't shake. Her face was bruised, exhausted, worn down to the edge, but there was nothing in those eyes that belonged to a victim. No fear, no pleading, no despair, only fatigue and resolve. The kind of resolve that belonged to someone who had grown used to losing everything and had learned how to stand up afterward. Stefan held her gaze in the mirror for 1 second longer. She didn't look away. Then he turned back to the road, pressed harder on the gas. The rain came down heavier, the wipers moved faster, and the black SUV tore north into the night, along the empty highway, carrying a crime boss who had just lost his home, a right-hand man bleeding through the shoulder, a woman who had nothing left but a blood-stained backpack, and a giant dog breathing across her lap. 4 lives inside one car. No one knew where they were going, but all of them knew they couldn't go back. At 4 a.m, the black SUV turned off the main road and onto a narrow dirt track cutting through the pine woods, and when the headlights swept across the dark, the cabin appeared at the edge of the lake like something forgotten. Small, dark, its roof covered with dry pine needles, one corner of the wooden porch sagging with rot. No name, no fence, nothing to suggest the place belonged to anyone. Stefan had bought it with cash 12 years earlier through 3 layers of shell companies, and not a single document in the world tied his name to that house. Only 2 people knew it existed, him and Jonas. Now Maren did too. Stefan killed the engine and sat still for 10 seconds in the dark, listening. Wind through the pine trees, lake water brushing softly against the rocky shore. No cars, no voices, nothing except nature breathing. Clean. He stepped out, opened the back door, and helped Jonas out first. Jonas was more awake than he had been in the car, but his footing still wavered, his right shoulder stiff from the towel wound tight around it, his face gray under the headlights. Maren followed behind, Goliath close at her heels, moving one slow step at a time over the damp ground, the tear in his flank no longer bleeding but the bandage soaked through with dried blood. Inside, the cabin was cold and dark. Stefan lit the fireplace. Flames began to lick through the dry wood, and the room slowly warmed beneath the scent of burning pine. Jonas was laid out on the kitchen table, the only place flat enough and bright enough once Stefan switched on the overhead light. Maren didn't wait for anyone to speak. She washed her hands in boiled water, found the first aid kit in the kitchen cupboard where Stefan pointed, and went to work. She cut away the makeshift towel bandage and examined the wound. The bullet had passed through the shoulder from back to front, missing the shoulder blade, missing the artery, but tearing badly through the deltoid muscle and costing him a significant amount of blood. Maren spoke to Jonas in the voice of an emergency room doctor, not in the voice of comfort. Lie on your side. Don't move the shoulder. Take 2 antibiotics from the first aid kit now. I'm going to stitch this by hand. It's going to hurt. There's no anesthetic. Bite down on this. She shoved a folded towel into Jonas's mouth. Then she stitched him up. 1 stitch at a time. Slow. Precise. Steady. Jonas groaned through the cloth, sweat soaking his forehead. But he didn't jerk, and he didn't cry out. He was used to pain. After 20 years with Stefan Kessler, he was used to everything. When Maren finished, she wrapped the wound and gave her final orders. Change the dressing every 4 hours. If he runs a fever, give him more antibiotics. Don't let him raise that arm above shoulder height for 2 weeks. Jonas looked at her with exhausted eyes. But something in his expression had shifted, something close to respect. And that wasn't something he gave easily to strangers. Goliath lay beside the fireplace, the warmth of the flames sinking into his ashen fur. The torn wound in his flank cleaned and redressed by Maren with fresh gauze and medical tape. The dog breathed evenly, eyes closed, muzzle resting on his front paws, and for the first time since the night at the Beacon Hill mansion, he looked peaceful. Katrin arrived the following afternoon. She had driven through the night from New York, following the coordinates Stefan had sent her through the private encrypted channel the 2 siblings used. When she stepped into the cabin, blonde hair twisted up, long coat on, her face etched in ice, the first thing she saw was Maren sitting beside Jonas on a kitchen chair, changing the bandage on his shoulder. Her hands were steady. The scissors cut the gauze with exact precision. Her mouth asked Jonas whether it hurt more than it had that morning, and Jonas shook his head. Katrin stood in the doorway watching that scene for 15 silent seconds. Then she stepped inside, set her bag down on the floor, and didn't object. She didn't ask who the woman was. She didn't say, "I warned you." She did nothing except sit in the chair across from them and pour herself a glass of water. It was the first time Stefan Kessler accepted Maren's presence without a word of protest. But that night, after Maren had gone to sleep and Jonas had drifted off under the weight of antibiotics, Katrin stepped out onto the porch, where Stefan stood alone in the dark, staring across the black lake. She stood beside him, arms folded across her chest, her breath turning white in the cold air. "You lost the mansion," she said, her voice neither high nor low, only factual. "You lost 2 men. Jonas almost died, all in 4 days, because of a girl you met 4 days ago." She turned and looked at him. "Explain." Stefan didn't look at his sister. He looked through the glass toward the living room, where Goliath lay beside the fireplace, the firelight flickering over his slate gray coat, his belly rising and falling in a slow rhythm. He was silent long enough that Katrin thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice low, slow, and heavier than anything Katrin had ever heard from him. "Father killed Nero, to teach me not to be weak. I listened for 28 years. He turned and looked at his sister for the first time that night. "That's enough." Katrin said nothing, because she knew what Nero was. She hadn't been there that day. She hadn't even been born yet. But she knew. She knew because sometimes in the middle of the night, she had seen her brother sitting alone in his study, turning an old, worn leather collar over and over in his hands, staring into nothing. She had never asked, and tonight was the first time he had spoken of it himself. Katrin looked out across the lake. Then she looked back into the living room, where the slate-gray dog lay breathing beside the fire. She didn't say another word. She only stood beside her brother in silence until dawn came close. 3 days after the night, Katrin stood beside her brother on the porch until nearly dawn. Stefan called the first meeting in the cabin by the lake. It wasn't a defensive meeting. Defense had ended with the fire that reduced the Beacon Hill mansion to ash. This was retaliation. Stefan sat at the kitchen table, spread out a blank sheet of paper, and wrote 2 names. Wade Pollard, Perry Whitfield. Then he drew a straight line connecting those 2 names and said to Jonas, Katrin, and Maren seated around him, "Don't hit Wade, hit Whitfield." Katrin understood at once. Jonas nodded. Maren looked at him, waiting for an explanation, but Stefan didn't explain much. He only said that Wade Pollard was a mid-level trafficker. He had guns, men, and cruelty. But the thing that truly kept him standing wasn't any of those. It was Perry Whitfield, a Boston city councilman, the man protecting all of Wade's operations through the port, the man keeping the police at a distance, the man who had turned Wade from a small-time dealer into someone untouchable. Cut Whitfield out, and Wade would be nothing but a stray dog with no spine, and a stray dog could be dealt with. Maren listened in silence for a moment. Then she said a name no one in the room had ever heard before. Priya Nair. Stefan looked at her. Maren began to explain. Priya had been her friend back in foster care. The 2 of them had lived in the same foster home from the ages of 14 to 18. The old photograph in the backpack showed the 2 of them at 16, standing in front of that weather-beaten gray house, grinning wide, not yet knowing that life would drag each of them in opposite directions. Priya was now an investigative reporter for the Boston Globe, and she had been following Whitfield's trail for months. Maren knew this because Priya had contacted her before Wade confiscated her phone. Stefan asked only one question. What does she have? Maren answered that she had a great deal, but not enough. Priya had roughly 70% of the file on Whitfield, including records of irregular meetings, offshore bank accounts, and phone contact with port intermediaries. But she lacked direct proof of the port transactions. She lacked the shipping codes. She lacked the hard numbers that tied Whitfield to illegal cargo moving through Boston. And that was what sat inside the flash drive in Maren's backpack. Stefan looked at Maren, then at the old battered backpack hanging from the hook beside the door. "Contact her," he said. "Set up a meeting." Maren called Priya from the new phone Jonas had bought with cash in a nearby town. The call was short. Maren's voice stayed calm, but the hand holding the phone tightened hard around it. 2 days later, Maren drove the second car Jonas had rented under a false name to a small diner in Stowe, 40 minutes from the cabin. Goliath sat in the back seat. His wound had begun to heal, but the dog still wouldn't let Maren get more than 10 steps away. Stefan wanted to go with her, but Maren said no. Priya wouldn't talk if a Mafia boss was sitting at the same table. Stefan didn't like that, but he understood. He let her go. The diner was small, half-empty, smelling of cheap coffee and toast. Priya sat at the last table, black hair cut short, round-framed glasses on, laptop already open though she wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking at the door. And when Maren stepped inside, Priya rose to her feet, both hands gripping the edge of the table, her face going white as though she were seeing a dead woman return. Maren. Just one word. Then tears. Priya pulled Maren into an embrace right there in the middle of the diner, held her tight, both hands trembling, and said through her crying, "I thought you were dead. Wade told me you were dead. He told everyone." Maren held her friend back. She didn't cry. She only closed her eyes and breathed. Then she sat down and told her story. Not all of it, only enough for Priya to understand that she was alive, that she was in hiding, and that she had what Priya needed. Maren placed the flash drive on the table between their 2 cups of coffee. Priya looked at it, then looked at Maren. "This is proof of the port transactions?" Maren nodded. Shipping codes, schedules, container numbers, recipients, everything. Priya picked up the flash drive and turned it over in her hand, her eyes lighting up in the way only an investigative reporter's eyes could light up when she was holding the final piece of a puzzle she had been building for months. "With this, Whitfield is finished. The FBI will have to open an investigation. They won't be able to ignore it anymore." But then Priya stopped. She looked at Maren, and something in her gaze shifted from excitement to concern. "Maren, these shipping codes, where did you get them?" Silence. Maren didn't answer at once. She looked down at her coffee, at the foam slowly dissolving, and in that stretch of silence a cold calculation was running through her mind. If she gave the flash drive to Priya, the evidence would bring Whitfield down. It would cut away Wade's protection. It would save her, save Goliath, save Stefan. But that evidence would also reveal who had gathered it, not some outsider who had merely found it in a desk drawer, but someone on the inside. Someone who had once stood at the port at 3 a.m. copying down container codes because Wade had sent her there. Someone who had signed her name on false customs declarations. Someone who had once been part of the system she was now trying to destroy. If the FBI opened an investigation, they would find Maren Cole's name in the records, and she would be prosecuted. Maren looked at Priya. "I found it," she said, her voice even, her eyes unblinking. Priya looked back at her, and there was the faintest flicker in her expression, showing that she didn't completely believe her, but she didn't press further. On the drive back to the cabin, Maren looked at Goliath in the rearview mirror. The dog looked back at her, his tail giving one soft wag. She thought of Stefan, of a cup of hot tea at 3 a.m. that he had never once set down for her, but she knew there would come a day when he would. She thought of the lie she was still keeping, and she knew that when the truth came out, because it would come out, she could lose everything she had only just begun to find. But she still said nothing. Not yet. Maren left the diner in Stowe late in the afternoon, beneath a sky that hung gray and low, clouds pressing down on the tops of the pines, as if they wanted to touch the earth. Goliath sat in the back seat, his muzzle resting on the edge of the door, his eyes half closed with the gentle sway of the car along the forest road. The flash drive had stayed behind with Priya. The lie had stayed behind in Maren's chest. She drove slowly, her mind circling the image of Priya's face when she held the flash drive, and the question her friend never spoke aloud, but had already asked with her eyes, when Goliath growled. Not the weak growl he had made when he was hurt, not the low sound of discomfort from pain. This was a deep, drawn-out growl from the bottom of a 60-kilogram chest. The kind of sound Maren had heard only twice in the 5 years she had raised him, once when a stranger tried to open the apartment door at midnight, and once when Wade walked toward her with a knife in his hand. A warning growl. Maren looked into the rearview mirror. A black SUV, dark tinted windows, no front plate, was following about 50 meters behind her. She couldn't remember when it had first appeared, but Goliath knew. The dog had turned his whole body around on the back seat, eyes fixed on the rear window, the fur along his neck standing up, the growl never stopping. Maren's heart began to pound, but her hands stayed on the wheel and they didn't shake. She glanced in the mirror again. The black SUV kept the same distance, never passing, never falling back, following her through every curve she took, for at least the last 3 intersections. She pulled out her phone with one hand and called Stefan. He answered after the first ring. "There's a car following me," Maren said, her voice calmer than her heartbeat by far. "Black SUV. No plates. Been on me since Stowe." Half a second of silence on the other end. Then Stefan's voice came through, flat and still, not a ripple in it. The voice Maren had already begun to recognize as the one he used when things were very bad. "Turn right at the next intersection. Head toward the old gas station on Route 17. Don't speed up. Don't brake hard. Keep it steady. Jonas is on the way." He hung up. He didn't say be careful. He didn't say he was worried. He didn't say anything extra. Just instructions. Maren turned right. The black SUV turned with her. Goliath growled louder. Both front paws braced against the back of the seat, his huge body crowding the rear bench, jowls parted, teeth showing. The dog wasn't afraid. He was angry. He recognized the smell of danger the way dogs did, not through logic, but through something older than that, and he was ready to fight even though the wound in his flank still hadn't fully healed. Route 17 was narrower, 2 winding lanes twisting through the pines, the pavement damp with evening mist. Maren kept her speed even, just as Stefan had told her, her eyes moving constantly between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. The SUV closed the gap. 30 meters. 20. She could make out the silhouette of the driver now, broad-shouldered, and another figure in the passenger seat. 2. At least 2. There was a short, straight stretch, before a sharp bend around the hillside. Maren saw the abandoned gas station on the left, its rusted metal roof sagging, the fuel pump stripped down to skeletal frames, and parked out of sight behind the station was the black truck Jonas usually drove. Maren kept the wheel steady and passed the gas station. The SUV followed close behind, into the curve, and Jonas came out. The truck rolled from behind the station and cut diagonally across the road, right at the narrow bend, completely blocking the lane behind Maren. The black SUV slammed on its brakes, Tires screamed across the wet pavement, the rear end whipping sideways, almost dropping into the drainage ditch by the road. Marin looked in the mirror. The SUV stopped less than 3 meters from Jonas's truck. 2 seconds of silence. Then the SUV reversed, fast, jerked the wheel, spun around on the narrow road with the sound of rubber grinding against asphalt, and tore off in the opposite direction. Fast, gone behind the bend in less than 10 seconds. Jonas didn't chase it. He stepped out of the truck, his right shoulder still fixed in its bandage, phone in his left hand as he called Stefan. They're gone. Couldn't catch them. 2 men, black SUV, maybe rented local. Marin sat in the car, her hands still on the wheel, while Goliath kept growling behind her even though the SUV had disappeared. She stared straight through the windshield at the pine woods ahead, and inside her chest, something shifted. It wasn't fear rising. Fear had lived with her for 5 years. She knew its smell, knew its shape, and what was running through her veins now wasn't that. It was anger. Marin drove back to the cabin after dark. She shut off the engine, sat in the car for another minute, then stepped out. Stefan was already waiting on the porch. He looked at her, read her face, and didn't ask if she was all right because he could already see exactly how she was. Marin walked past him into the house, set the car keys down on the kitchen table, and sat in the chair. Her hands were shaking. For the first time since the night she staggered through the gates of the Beacon Hill mansion, Marin Cole's hands were shaking. Not from fear, because she was so angry her body couldn't contain it. For 5 years, Wade Pollard had taken everything from her. Her home, her freedom, her body, her identity. She had escaped. She had found a safe place. And he was still there, still following, still refusing to let go. Goliath came in, lay down at Marin's feet, and rested his muzzle on her shoe, heavy and warm. Marin looked down at the dog, then up at Stefan standing in the kitchen doorway. "He knows we're in Vermont," she said, her voice steady again. But beneath that steadiness was steel. "We're running out of time." Katrin didn't trust Marin from the first day. She accepted the woman's presence because Jonas was still alive because of her hands, because her brother had spoken Nero's name for the first time in his life because of her. But acceptance didn't mean trust. Stefan Kessler had grown up in a Mafia family, and the first lesson she was ever taught hadn't come from her father, because her father died when she was 12, but from the collapse he left behind. Never trust anyone just because they look harmless. So while Stefan focused on striking back, and Jonas focused on healing, Katrin sat in the small attic bedroom of the cabin, her laptop open, her encrypted phone beside her, and dug. She had someone inside the Boston customs system. Not an insider in the literal sense, but someone who knew how to find records no one was supposed to be able to find. It took 2 days. 2 days for the name Marin Cole to appear on 3 false customs declarations at the port of Boston, 3 different shipments over the course of 18 months, each declaration bearing the signature of the receiving party, and that name was Marin Cole. Not a witness, not an outsider who had simply found evidence in a desk drawer. A participant. Katrin printed the 3 declarations, folded them, went downstairs where Stefan was sitting at the kitchen table, studying a map of Boston streets on his phone. She laid the 3 pages in front of him and said, "Read." Stefan read, slowly. He read the name on each declaration. Marin Cole, Marin Cole, Marin Cole. 3 times. He didn't frown. He didn't clench his jaw. There wasn't a single reaction on his face that Katrin could read, and that was the most frightening thing of all, because Katrin knew that when her brother showed absolutely nothing, that was when he was hurting the most. Stefan folded the 3 pages, stood, and walked into the living room where Marin was sitting on the floor beside Goliath, her hand rubbing the dog's belly, her mouth murmuring something soft to him. She looked up when she heard Stefan's footsteps. She saw the 3 papers in his hand, and she knew. Marin didn't need to read them to know what they were. She could see it in Stefan's eyes, in the way he stood in the living room doorway, exactly the way he had stood on the first day when she woke up on the sofa, keeping his distance, watching, judging. But this time there was no curiosity, only silence. Stefan placed the 3 papers on the coffee table in front of Marin. He didn't speak. He didn't shout. He didn't slam his hand down. He only stood there, both arms hanging at his sides, and looked at her with eyes whose silence weighed more than any accusation ever could. The silence of a man who felt betrayed by the very thing he had only just begun to trust. Marin looked down at the 3 pages. looked at her own signature. Then she looked up, and she didn't apologize. She told it all. From the beginning. The whole thing. Wade started forcing her to receive shipments at the port when she was 23. He needed someone who looked legitimate. Someone with clean papers. No criminal record. Someone ordinary on site. She was the perfect choice. A young nurse, small-framed, the kind of woman no one would ever look at twice. The first time he took her there, she didn't know what she was signing. The second time she knew, and she wanted to refuse, and Wade broke the little finger on her left hand. The third time he didn't need to force her anymore because by then, she understood the rule, do it or lose something else. But from the third time on, she started keeping notes, shipping codes, container numbers, the real names of the recipients, dates, times, everything in the small hardcover notebook, not because she was brave, because it was survival instinct. She knew that one day either she would escape or she would die, and if she escaped, she would need a weapon. "I didn't tell you from the beginning," Marin said, her voice steady, her eyes fixed on Stefan's, "because I was afraid you'd throw me out before hearing all of it, and if you threw me out, I'd die. Goliath would die." Stefan didn't answer. He looked at her for 3 long seconds, then turned and walked out onto the porch. The wooden door shut behind him, not hard, not softly, just shut. And Goliath stood up. The dog looked at Marin, looked at the door Stefan had just gone through, and then followed Stefan, not Marin. He walked out onto the porch, lay down beside the feet of the man standing against the railing, staring out over the black lake, and rested his muzzle on Stefan's shoe. Marin remained alone in the living room, the 3 pages in front of her, and she understood that she had just lost both of them. Hours passed. Katrin went to bed. Jonas had been asleep long before that under the pull of antibiotics. The cabin was silent except for the soft crackle of fire in the hearth and the wind off the lake slipping through the seams of the walls. Marin didn't sleep. She sat in the kitchen chair, both arms wrapped around her knees, eyes open, staring into the dark. 3 a.m. The porch door opened. Footsteps crossed the wooden floor. Stefan walked into the kitchen. He didn't look at Marin. He turned on the stove, heated water, made a cup of hot tea. Then he placed the cup in front of her. He didn't speak. Marin looked at the tea. Steam rose from it, warm, carrying the faint scent of herbs. Then she looked at him. Stefan sat down in the chair across from her. Goliath came in behind him, lay down on the floor between them, muzzle resting on his front paws, eyes closed. Tears slid down Marin's face. She didn't wipe them away. She didn't wipe them away because if she did, she would have to admit she was crying, and she hadn't cried in front of anyone for 5 years. But a cup of hot tea at 3 a.m, made by a man who didn't speak a single word of forgiveness and still made tea for her, broke something that 5 years of Wade Pollard's violence had never managed to break. Stefan didn't look at her while she cried. He looked at Goliath lying on the floor, and the two of them sat there, in the kitchen, in silence, the cup of tea steaming between them on the table, until morning came. 2 days after the night of that silent midnight peace, the cabin by the lake in Vermont sank into a kind of quiet none of the 4 people inside it had ever known. It wasn't the quiet of waiting. It wasn't the quiet before a storm. It was the rare quiet of people so exhausted that their bodies had decided to stop, even though their minds still hadn't given permission. Goliath was the first to recover for real. The stitches along his flank had dried. The heavy folds of charcoal skin had begun to close around the black seam of thread, and the dog started moving around more. Not the heavy dragging shuffle of the week before, but movement with purpose, his muzzle lifting to catch the air, his tail giving a soft wag when he stepped onto the porch, his 4 legs testing the ground around the house before circling back. But there was one thing Goliath did that everyone noticed. Every few minutes, no matter where he was, he turned to look for Stefan. If he saw him on the porch, he kept going. If he didn't, he came back at once, searching until his eyes found him. And only then did he settle. Jonas joked to Katrin that the dog had a tracking system wired straight to the boss, but no one laughed, because all of them understood that it wasn't a habit. It was a choice. Goliath had chosen Stefan from the night he ate from his hand in the kitchen of the Beacon Hill mansion, and from that moment on, he hadn't changed. Marin watched that every day, and she wasn't jealous, wasn't sad, only touched by it in a strange and gentle way. The dog she had rescued from a garbage box, the dog she had raised on a nurse's thin paycheck, the dog she had protected with her whole body for 5 years, now turned to look for another man whenever he felt uncertain. But he still slept at her feet every night, still licked her hand every morning. He hadn't left her. He had only added one more person to the list of things he guarded. Maren started cooking on the second day. No one asked her to. No one suggested it. She simply got up, opened the kitchen cupboards, found the groceries Jonas had bought in town, and cooked. Eggs in the morning, soup at noon, pasta at night. Simple, nothing elaborate, but she needed to do it. She needed her hands busy so her mind would stop thinking. She needed the smell of food to fill the kitchen and push out the smell of blood and gunpowder still clinging to memory. She needed the sound of boiling water and knives against the cutting board to replace the sound of gunfire and shattering glass. Stefan repaired the porch. The western corner had rotted, the boards bowed under weight, and each morning he went out there with a hammer and nails. The sound of the hammer rang through the cold air, steady, rhythmic, repeating. And Maren realized that was how Stefan handled everything turning inside his head. She cooked. He drove nails. Both of them were healing themselves by keeping their hands busy. On the afternoon of the second day, when Jonas was asleep from an afternoon nap and Katrin was upstairs speaking on the phone with one of her people in Boston, Maren carried 2 cups of tea out to the porch. She set one down beside Stefan, who was sitting on the newly repaired wooden step, then sat down half a meter away from him. Goliath was already lying there, right between them, his head resting on Stefan's foot, his tail stretched long enough to touch Maren's leg. The lake in front of them was still, its surface reflecting the pale gray sky, the shoreline edged with deep green pine woods, and there wasn't a sound except the light wind and the water touching the rocks. They sat in silence for a while. Then Stefan spoke, without looking at her, his eyes still on the lake. "Before all this happened, what did you like?" Maren didn't answer right away, not because she didn't know, but because it had been so long since anyone had asked her that. 5 years with Wade, and no one had asked what she liked. Before that, in foster care, no one had asked either. The question, "What do you like?" was a luxury she had forgotten she was ever allowed to answer. She looked out at the lake, at the water, at the pine trees, at the wooden porch Stefan had just repaired, and she answered in a voice so soft it was nearly a whisper. Reading on a porch in the afternoon. That was all. Not travel, not money, not freedom in any grand and dramatic sense. Just sitting on a porch, holding a book, and reading in the afternoon. The smallest dream a person could have. So small it was only the most ordinary version of a life most people took for granted. Stefan listened. He didn't say, "I'll give you that," or anything else a man in a film might say. He only gave the slightest nod, as if she had just said something completely reasonable, and drank his tea. The silence returned. But this time it wasn't heavy. There was nothing pressing down inside it. No lie hanging in the air, no gunfire echoing behind it, no shadow of Wade waiting in the corner. For the first time since Maren walked through the gates of the Beacon Hill mansion, the silence between her and Stefan carried no fear. Goliath breathed steadily at their feet. The lake wind moved softly across the newly repaired porch. The tea cooled in their cups, and for that moment, everything almost seemed all right. That peaceful afternoon was the last beautiful thing before everything broke apart again. At midnight, Maren woke to the sound of a whimper. Not a human sound, but one rising from the wooden floor beside her bed, where Goliath slept every night. She reached down to touch the dog's head and jerked back. Hot. His whole body burned like a stove, his slate gray coat drenched with sweat, his jaws hanging open, his tongue lolling as he panted, fast and shallow. Maren switched on the lamp. The stitches along Goliath's flank were swollen, the skin around the seam dark red and spreading, and when she pressed lightly at the edge of the wound, thick white pus seeped through the gaps in the stitches. Infection. Severe. The bacteria had already entered his blood, because this wasn't a local fever. This was a full-body fever, the kind that in a human would mean intravenous antibiotics in a hospital, and in a 60-kilogram dog in the woods of Vermont meant a miracle. Maren ran into the living room where Stefan was sleeping on the sofa. She didn't need to call out. She only touched his shoulder and said, "Goliath has a fever. Sepsis." Stefan's eyes opened at once, the way the eyes of a man opened who had never truly slept deeply in his life. He sat up and followed her into the room. He looked at the dog stretched on the floor, panting, his coat wet, his eyes unfocused, and he pulled out his phone and called Harrison. The veterinarian answered after 4 rings, his voice thick with sleep. When Stefan described the symptoms, Harrison fell silent for several seconds, then said the dog needed to be brought to the clinic immediately. Sepsis in a large breed could trigger organ failure within 6 to 8 hours. But the nearest clinic was 2 hours away, and outside the window, a blizzard was coming down over Vermont in thick white sheets, the wind hitting hard enough to bend the pine trees, the forest roads certainly buried by now. No one could drive through that. Stefan looked at Maren. Maren hadn't waited for him to look. She was already washing her hands in boiling water from the kettle on the stove, turning toward the kitchen cupboard to pull out the first aid kit, then opening the drawer to find a knife, the smallest kitchen knife. Thin blade, sharp. She dropped it into the pot of boiling water. Then she soaked gauze in rubbing alcohol, wrung it out, and laid the squares in neat stacks across a clean towel. Her hands were steady, not trembling by a single millimeter. The skill of a nurse had sunk into bone, muscle, into the body's memory where no fear could erase it. She knelt beside Goliath, stroked his head once, then said to Stefan, "Hold him. Hold him tight. I have to open the wound and drain the pus. It's going to hurt." Stefan knelt on the other side and braced Goliath's body with both arms. The dog whimpered when Maren cut the stitches and opened the wound with the knife that had been boiled clean. The pus came out thick and white with a sharp, rotten smell. Maren pressed it out, wiped it away with gauze soaked in alcohol, and the dog jerked and whimpered, but he didn't bite. He only pressed his muzzle into Stefan's hand as if looking for something to hold on to. Maren flushed the wound 3 times with diluted saline, laid fresh gauze over it, and wrapped it again. Then she sat back against the wall and said, "Now we wait. Change the dressing every hour. If the fever breaks before morning, he'll make it. If not..." She didn't finish the sentence. Stefan sat down beside her, beside Goliath, and he waited. Every hour Maren changed the gauze, checked the dog's temperature by laying her hand against his belly. Still hot, still burning. Goliath's breathing grew faster, shallower, his eyes closed, his huge body shivering across the wooden floor. Stefan stayed there the entire time. He didn't stand up, didn't go outside, could do nothing except watch. His power, his money, his men, the whole empire he had built over 20 years, all of it was utterly useless inside that room. He couldn't order the infection to stop, couldn't threaten the fever, couldn't buy more time. All he could do was sit there and watch the dog he had begun to love fight for his life on the floorboards. 4 in the morning. Goliath's breathing weakened visibly. Each breath took longer. The space between one breath and the next grew wider, as though his body were beginning to forget how to breathe. Maren bent down to change the dressing for the 5th time, and her hand shook. For the first time that night, her hand shook. Not because her skill had failed, but because her body had been awake for 7 hours under extreme strain, muscles drained, adrenaline gone. And the only thing keeping her upright now was will, and will wasn't enough to keep her fingers steady. Stefan saw it. He didn't speak. He only reached out and took her hands in his, both of his hands wrapping around both of hers, holding them still, making them steady enough to place the fresh gauze over Goliath's wound. Then he spoke. His voice broke. Not the voice Jonas heard every day. Not the flat, controlled voice Katrin knew. Not the voice of the Mafia boss, who held the Northeast in his grip. The voice of a 9-year-old boy standing frozen in a backyard, watching the dog he loved most in the world get shot and being powerless to stop it. "Don't let him die." Maren looked at him, looked into eyes wet without spilling into tears, because Kessler's didn't cry, never cried, and yet those eyes were breaking in a way tears could never fully show. She tightened her grip on his hand and said, "I won't." Dawn came slowly through the windows of the cabin. Pale gray light slipped through the curtains, and with it, Goliath breathed deeper, slower, more evenly. Maren pressed her hand to the dog's belly and felt the heat beginning to come down, slowly, like a fire burning itself out. The fever broke. Goliath opened his eyes. Those clouded eyes looked upward, searching for someone, and found Stefan. The dog licked his hand once, slow, weak, but there. Stefan closed his eyes. His hand was still holding Maren's. Maren's hand was still holding his. Neither of them pulled away. 3 days after the night Goliath nearly died, the dog began to stand again. Slowly, heavily. The fresh incision in his flank, still red and damp beneath the bandage, Maren changed every morning. But he stood. He walked from the bedroom to the living room, from the living room to the kitchen, from the kitchen to the porch, and wherever he went, He looked for Stefan first. If Stefan was in the kitchen, Goliath lay at his feet in the kitchen. If Stefan went out to the porch, Goliath dragged his 60-kilogram body out to the porch. If Stefan rose and crossed into another room, Goliath rose and followed, the wound pulling tight, a soft whine slipping out of him. But still, he followed. Maren watched that on the morning of the third day when she carried Goliath's food bowl out to the porch and found the dog pressed close against Stefan's leg while he sat drinking coffee, his muzzle resting on Stefan's shoe, his tail giving a lazy wag. She set the bowl down and Goliath lifted his head, looked at the food, looked at her, then looked at Stefan as if asking permission. Stefan gave the slightest nod, almost without thinking, and the dog began to eat. Maren laughed. A small laugh, quick and startled, so unexpected that even she flinched at the sound of it. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed. Maybe before Wade. Maybe before foster care. Maybe somewhere inside a memory so faded she wasn't sure it had ever really existed. But this morning, watching a giant dog lift his eyes to ask permission from a Mafia boss before eating breakfast, she laughed. Stefan looked at her and said nothing, but the corner of his mouth lifted for 1/10 of a second before settling back into place. Jonas saw it. And Jonas, a man who had spent 20 years beside Stefan Kessler and had never once seen his boss's mouth bend for anything unrelated to victory, decided it was time to get to the real work. That afternoon, the kitchen table in the cabin became a war room. Not the kind of war room from films with giant screens and maps pinned to walls. Just 4 people sitting around an old oak table, a phone on speaker in the middle, and Goliath lying beneath the table between everyone's feet. Stefan sat at the head, Jonas to his right, shoulder still bandaged, arm hanging in its sling but his eyes sharp and clear. Katrin to his left, laptop open, her fingers tapping lightly on the table out of habit whenever she concentrated. Maren sat across from Stefan, back straight, hands resting on the table, and from the phone between them, Priya Nair's voice came through clearly, though touched with static from the weak reception out in rural Vermont. Stefan spoke first, brief, precise, not one wasted word. A 3-step plan. Step 1. Priya publishes the investigative piece on Whitfield in the Boston Globe. She uses the evidence from the flash drive but protects the source completely. No mention of Maren, no mention of anyone directly connected. The article only needs to hit hard enough that the FBI can't ignore it, detailed enough that Whitfield knows someone is holding his entire file. Step 2. Once Whitfield is summoned by the FBI and panic starts to set in, Stefan sends him a choice through an intermediary. Either he handles Wade Pollard himself, cuts every connection, and makes sure Wade never opens his mouth about Whitfield, or Stefan releases more evidence, the kind no lawyer alive could save him from. Step 3. Once Wade loses Whitfield, he loses protection, loses the police, loses everything that kept him untouchable, and Stefan handles what remains. Katrin was the first to object. She closed her laptop and looked straight at her brother. Step 2. You're betting Whitfield will choose to kill Wade instead of killing us. What if he chooses the opposite? What if he decides Maren is a bigger threat than Wade and sends people here? Stefan hadn't answered yet when Maren spoke. Her voice was calm, neither high nor low, the kind of voice that made every room go still and listen, because it carried the weight of someone who had lived inside Wade Pollard's system for 5 years and understood exactly how it worked. Whitfield won't choose to kill us, because killing us doesn't solve the article once it's published. The article is public. The FBI will have seen it. It can't be pulled back. The only thing Whitfield can still control at that point is which thread leads back to him, and the biggest thread is Wade. She looked around the table. Wade believes loyalty can be bought with money. He pays Whitfield, Whitfield protects him, and he thinks that makes it permanent. That's his only weakness. He won't believe Whitfield has betrayed him until it's too late. Silence settled around the table. Priya's voice came through the phone. I can publish within a week. My editor approved the direction of the piece last month. I only need to add the port evidence. Katrin looked at Maren longer than usual, and for the first time there was something in her eyes beyond suspicion, something closer to reluctant respect. Beneath the table, Goliath breathed evenly, his muzzle resting on Stefan's shoe. The Essex in Burlington sat on the second floor of a gray stone building overlooking Lake Champlain, the kind of restaurant where the menu didn't print prices because the people who came there never needed to ask. Stefan arrived alone. Black suit, white shirt with no tie, hair brushed back, a face of rigid granite, unreadable and still. Jonas parked 2 blocks away, his shoulder still bandaged, but his left hand resting on the gun beneath the driver's seat, eyes fixed on the restaurant entrance through the windshield. Katrin listened to everything through the small microphone clipped inside Stefan's collar, sitting in a hotel room 3 minutes away by car, her laptop already open. This step had not been part of the 3-step plan. This was the move Stefan had added for himself, because he needed to see Whitfield's face before pushing the piece across the board. He needed to judge the animal before locking it in the cage. Perry Whitfield was already seated at the corner table by the window, late afternoon sunlight touching the silver in his perfectly trimmed hair, his tailored blue-gray suit immaculate, the gold watch flashing at his wrist, a politician's smile resting on his mouth as Stefan approached, 55 years old, third-term Boston City Councilman, a face in the papers every week, shaking hands with voters and cutting ceremonial ribbons. On the surface, it was a meeting between a successful businessman from the Northeast and an influential politician. 2 glasses of wine, 2 plates of steak, 2 polite smiles. Underneath, it was 2 animals sitting across a white tablecloth and scenting each other out, each one measuring how dangerous the other might be. Whitfield spoke first. His voice was warm, low, polished by thousands of public speeches, the kind of voice that made people want to believe him even when they shouldn't. He asked Stefan about business conditions, about the New England real estate market, about things both men knew neither of them cared about. Stefan answered in short sentences, just polite enough, his eyes never leaving Whitfield's face. He was reading him, reading the way he held his wine glass, the way he cut his meat, the way he placed his hands on the table, the way his eyes shifted whenever a waiter passed nearby. An ordinary person would have looked at Whitfield and seen an elegant gentleman. Stefan looked at him and saw a man built entirely out of control. Control of voice, control of gesture, control of every smallest detail on his own face, the kind of man who never lost composure because he never let emotion touch a decision. 10 times more dangerous than Wade Pollard, because Wade hurt people with his fists, while Whitfield destroyed them with a phone call. In the middle of dessert, Whitfield set down his knife and fork, touched the corner of his mouth with his napkin, and said gently, "I hear you've had a guest at your house recently." A young woman. Stefan didn't react. Not one muscle in his face moved. He only raised his wine glass to his lips, took a sip, and waited. Whitfield went on, his voice still as warm as if he were discussing the weather. "Wade's property is Wade's concern. I don't interfere in a partner's personal matters, but when Wade's problem begins to become my problem." He let the sentence trail off, picked up his dessert spoon, scooped up a bite of creme brulee, and ate with perfect calm. He didn't need to finish. Both men understood the rest. Stefan set down his wine glass, watched Whitfield eat dessert, and inside his mind, the analysis was complete. Whitfield had called Marin Wade's property in exactly the same tone a man might use for a car or a dining room set, not because he was cruel in Wade's way, the way of fists and knives, but because, to Whitfield, people were only entries on a spreadsheet: assets, liabilities, expenses, revenue. Marin was an entry sitting in the column marked risk, and the moment the risk outweighed the value, Whitfield would erase that line without blinking. Stefan stood before the coffee was served. He shook Whitfield's hand, gave him a courteous smile, and walked out. Outside, the wind off Lake Champlain struck cold across his face. He got into Jonas's waiting car, closed the door, and sat still for 10 seconds. Jonas didn't ask anything. He waited. Then Stefan spoke, his voice low, his eyes fixed straight through the windshield. "Whitfield will sell Wade out faster than we thought." Jonas looked at him in the rearview mirror. "How fast?" "The second he feels threatened. He's the type who discards a broken tool, not the type who saves a friend. Wade thinks money bought Whitfield's loyalty. But Whitfield doesn't have loyalty. He only has interests." Jonas started the engine and pulled out of the lot. On the drive back to the cabin, Stefan closed his eyes and leaned his head against the seat. In his ears, Whitfield's voice was still there, saying Wade's property in that polished, courteous warmth, and Stefan thought of Marin sitting on the porch of the cabin saying she liked reading in the afternoon. The quietest of ambitions, and of the silver-haired man who had just eaten dessert across from him, a man fully willing to erase that dream from the earth if it landed in the wrong column on his ledger. Stefan opened his eyes. "Call Priya," he said to Jonas. "Tell her to run the story." Priya Nair's article hit the front page of the Boston Globe on Monday morning, and by noon Boston was shaking. The headline didn't need to be sensational because the content already carried enough weight. A 3-term city councilman directly tied to an illegal shipping network through the port of Boston, with evidence that included shipping codes, container numbers, offshore accounts, and schedules matching federal customs records. Priya did not reveal her source. She did not mention Marin. She did not mention Stefan. There was only data, numbers, and money trails so clear that any prosecutor who read them would have no choice but to open an investigation. The FBI summoned Whitfield that very afternoon. By the evening news, the story was everywhere across Boston television. Councilman Perry Whitfield, stepping out of the federal building, face composed, politician's smile still in place, but his eyes already dead, lawyers on either side of him, refusing to answer reporters' questions. Stefan watched the broadcast on the small television in the living room of the cabin. He didn't smile. There was no victory in him. Step 1 was complete, but Step 2 was the real game. Jonas sent Whitfield the choice through an intermediary that very night. An envelope with no name on it, left at the front desk of the hotel where Whitfield was staying after leaving the federal building. Inside was only a single sheet of paper with 2 typed lines. Wade Pollard knows everything. Either you handle the problem, or the problem handles you. No signature. None was needed. Whitfield panicked. Just as Stefan had predicted in the restaurant in Burlington, just as Marin had analyzed in the war room around the kitchen table, Whitfield was the kind of man who discarded a broken tool. He didn't think long. He made calls. Not to lawyers, not to the police. He called the kind of people a corrupt 3-term councilman always kept in his private contacts, the kind who handled problems without leaving paperwork behind. Wade Pollard had to disappear. But Wade was not the kind of man who disappeared easily. 42 years in the underworld had taught him something no university ever could: how to smell betrayal. When 2 of Whitfield's men came to the apartment Wade had rented in South Boston on the 3rd night after the article ran, Wade was no longer there. He had left the day before, not run. Wade Pollard did not run. He tracked. From the employee who had betrayed Stefan the night the mansion was attacked, the one Wade had kept in contact with, he knew Stefan had a cabin in Vermont. Not the exact address, but the region. Near a lake, north of Stowe, off a forest road. Enough to find if a man was crazy enough. And Wade was crazy enough. He drove through the night to Vermont alone, in an old car, no GPS, no phone, only a handgun in his coat pocket, and a shotgun on the passenger seat. No men, no plan, no way out. He wasn't coming to take Marin back. That had already passed. He was coming for revenge. Because Stefan Kessler had taken what belonged to him, had destroyed his network, had turned him from an untouchable man into a hunted animal. And Wade Pollard, with nothing left to lose, was the most dangerous version of himself. Night fell over the lake in Vermont. It wasn't raining, but the wind moved through the pine woods with a long, cold whistle, and the black surface of the lake reflected gray clouds racing across the sky. Inside the cabin, Goliath began to grow restless. The dog rose from where he had been lying beside the fireplace, walked to the door, stood staring into the darkness through the crack, ears up, nose working, then paced, then returned to the door. Again and again, Marin noticed first. She had lived beside Goliath long enough to know that this dog never grew restless without a reason. The last time he had been like this was on the drive back from Stowe when the black SUV had followed them. She looked at Stefan. He had already been watching Goliath. He stood up, not fast but not slow, walked into the bedroom, opened the cabinet drawer, took out the Beretta, checked the magazine, chambered around. Jonas was already on the porch, gun in his left hand, right shoulder still stiff, eyes sharp. Stefan said to Marin, "Go into the back room. Take Goliath with you. Lock the door." Marin stood in front of him. She didn't argue. She didn't ask what was happening because she already knew. She looked at him, and then she did something she had never done before. She reached out and took his hand. First, not because she was afraid. She had passed beyond fear a long time ago, but because she wanted him to know, before he stepped out that door into the dark, that someone here was waiting for him to come back. Stefan looked at her hand holding his. Small, thin, still marked with calluses from 5 years of labor inside that prison of an apartment, but warm. He lifted his eyes to hers, gave one single nod, then he pulled his hand free, turned, and stepped out onto the porch. The wind off the lake hit his face with a hard, cold edge. Darkness stood thick between the pine trunks. The surface of the lake was black as ink. And then, from the trees, not far from the house, came the sharp, dry crack of a breaking branch in the still night. Wade Pollard stepped out of the darkness between the pine trunks like something the forest itself had spat back out. He was no longer the controlled, self-assured man Marin had feared for 5 years. No longer the calm voice that had sent a video of a burning apartment with a threat spoken as lightly as a weather report. This was the final version of Wade, the version that had nothing left. His eyes were bloodshot, his beard unshaven for days, his coat smeared with mud and rotting leaves, his hair greasy, his body carrying the smell of sweat and gasoline. A handgun hung in his right hand. The barrel pointed toward the ground, but his finger was already resting on the trigger. He looked like an animal driven into its last corner, and an animal in its last corner no longer fears death. It only wants to bite. Stefan stood on the patch of grass between the cabin and the lake, the Beretta in his hand but not yet raised. Jonas was on the porch to the left, hidden behind a wooden post, his gun ready, but Stefan stopped him with a glance. Wait. The 2 men stood 10 meters apart on grass wet with night dew, the wind from the lake passing between them carrying the smell of water and old pine needles. Wade looked at Stefan. Stefan looked back. Then Wade spoke, his voice hoarse and broken, as if his throat had spent too many hours shouting while he drove through the night to get here. "You think you're different from me?" He laughed, a short cracked sound like a dry branch snapping. "You're a monster too. You kill people. You traffic. You run an empire on other people's blood. How are you any different from me? More money, that's all." Stefan didn't answer. Not because he had nothing to say, but because with a man holding a gun in a state where he had nothing left to lose, every word was kindling. Wade took another step forward. The gun was still pointed down, but his finger tightened harder around the trigger. "I know more about you than you think, Kessler." I asked around. I dug. "You know what I found out?" He tilted his head, that broken smile still hanging from his mouth. "The dog. The Rottweiler." Stefan went still. Not enough for Wade to see it clearly in the dark, but enough for Stefan to feel the blood in his veins turn half a degree colder. "Your father shot him, didn't he?" Wade went on, his voice slower now, more pleased with itself, like a man who knew he had finally found the crack in the wall. "Nero, that was his name. I got it from one of your family's old guards. The bastard remembered it real well. Said your father tied the dog to a post and shot him in front of you. You just stood there and didn't move." Wade stepped forward again. 8 meters now. "And now look at you, almost dying over another dog. Over a woman who showed up carrying one. Kesslers aren't weak. Isn't that what your father said?" That one struck home. Not into flesh, but into the deepest place inside him, the place Stefan had buried for 28 years beneath ice and violence and power, the place where the old leather collar still lived inside his coat pocket. Stefan clenched his jaw, his fingers tightened around the grip of the gun. And just then, the cabin door opened. Goliath burst out. Marin couldn't hold him back, or simply because the dog was stronger than her arms, or maybe he had heard Wade's voice and recognized the voice that had come with the knife driven into his flank on the steps of the Dorchester apartment. The dog didn't run toward Wade. He didn't attack. He ran to the space between them, between Stefan and Wade. All 4 legs planted in the wet grass, his 60-kilogram body rising into a slate-gray wall. His head lowered, his eyes fixed directly on Wade. No growl, no retreat. He simply stood there. Wade looked at the dog. The broken smile vanished. He raised the gun, the barrel pointing straight at Goliath. "I stabbed you once," he said, his voice shaking with anger or cold or both. "I can do it again." The gunshot cracked, but it didn't come from Wade. It didn't come from Stefan. It came from the woods, from behind Wade, where the darkness was thickest between the pine trunks. 2 shots. Dry, sharp, clean. Wade jerked forward. The gun slipped from his hand and dropped onto the wet grass without a sound. He looked down at his chest, where 2 red blooms were spreading across the muddy coat, then lifted his head and looked at Stefan. There was no hatred in his eyes, no pain, only shock. Pure shock, the kind that belonged to a man betrayed by the very system he had trusted with everything. He paid Whitfield. Whitfield protected him. He had believed that was loyalty, and that loyalty had just put 2 bullets in his back. Wade Pollard fell onto the grass beside the lake in Vermont, his eyes open, staring up at a sky full of stars he could no longer see, and then the light left them. The two dark figures in the woods withdrew without a sound. Professional. Clean. That was how Whitfield's world worked. No dirty hands, no trace, no existence. Stefan stood looking at Wade's body. No triumph, no relief. Nothing at all except a deep exhaustion, the kind that came from traveling too far to reach this point, and no longer knowing what emotion was the right one to feel. Goliath turned back. The dog left his place as a wall in the grass, walked to Stefan, and pushed his head into Stefan's hand. Warm muzzle, damp muzzle, heavy in his palm. The cabin door opened. Maren stepped onto the porch, barefoot on the cold boards, her eyes moving across the grass, to Wade lying there, to Stefan standing there. She came down the steps, walked to his side, and placed her hand on his shoulder. She didn't speak. She only touched him. 3 figures stood in silence beside the lake at night. The man, the woman, and the dog. The wind moved over them, carrying the smell of lake water and pine. The black surface of the lake reflected the stars, and Wade Pollard lay on the wet grass, his eyes open to the sky, seeing nothing anymore. The next morning, the lake in Vermont lay flat and still, as if nothing had ever happened. A thin layer of mist drifted over the water, white and soft, blurring the line between lake and shore as though nature itself were erasing the boundary between last night and today. Everything had been handled before dawn. Jonas made 2 phone calls from his private encrypted device, neither call lasting more than 30 seconds, his voice even, offering no explanations. That was how Stefan Kessler's world worked. There were people whose job was to do the things no one needed to know the details of, no one asked why, and no one remembered what they had heard. Before the first ray of sunlight touched the lake, the strip of grass along the shore was clean. No blood, no body, no footprints. Only grass wet with dew and the smell of damp earth, exactly like any other morning in Vermont. Katrin was the first to leave. She had packed at some point without anyone noticing, her bag already by the door, her coat over her shoulders, her car keys in her hand. She stood on the porch for a moment, looking out at the lake, then turned back inside, where Maren was making tea in the kitchen. The 2 women looked at each other. 10 days earlier, Katrin had called Maren a threat. 5 days earlier, Katrin had handed Stefan proof that Maren had lied. 3 days earlier, Katrin had sat beside Maren in the war room around the kitchen table and listened as she laid out Wade Pollard's weakness in a voice calmer than anyone else in the room. And last night, when the shots rang out on the grass, Katrin had run to the porch and seen that Maren was already there, her hand resting on her brother's shoulder, silent, steady, exactly where she needed to be. Katrin stepped forward. She hugged Maren. It was brief, awkward, both arms stiff like someone who wasn't used to embracing anyone, but it was real. Then she said quietly near Maren's ear, her voice not soft but sincere, "Take care of my brother. He doesn't know how to take care of himself." Maren nodded. Katrin let go, turned away, and walked to her car without looking back. Jonas left 2 hours after Katrin. His right shoulder was still bandaged, his arm hanging in a sling, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He needed to return to Boston. The organization needed to be rebuilt after the loss of the mansion. People had to be replaced. The hole left behind by the traitor had to be sealed. Before he got into the car, Jonas stopped beside Stefan on the porch. The 2 men looked at each other the way men do after 20 years of blood and silence shared. Without needing many words, Jonas asked, "When are you coming back?" Stefan looked out at the lake, looked at Goliath moving slowly along the grass by the shore, nose to the ground, tail swaying lightly, looked at Maren standing in the kitchen window, a cup of tea in her hands, her eyes turned outside. "I don't know yet," he said. Jonas nodded. He didn't ask again. He knew that answer didn't mean never, and it didn't mean soon. It meant that for the first time in 20 years, Stefan Kessler did not know what his next move would be. And for Jonas, who had watched his boss always know the answer before the question was ever asked, "I don't know yet," was the most honest thing he had ever heard him say. By afternoon, the cabin was quiet for the first time since they had arrived. No Katrin tapping on her laptop in the attic. No Jonas moving from window to window checking the locks. Only Maren, Stefan, and Goliath. Maren's phone vibrated. Priya. Maren answered at the kitchen window, her back against the wooden frame, her eyes on the lake. Priya spoke quickly, her voice bright with relief and excitement. The article had hit harder than expected. 2 national newspapers had picked it up. The FBI had opened a formal investigation. Whitfield had been arrested that morning at his home in Boston. The source was fully protected. No one had traced the flash drive. No one knew the name Maren Cole. Her name did not appear in any public document connected to the case. She would not be prosecuted. Maren listened, ended the call, and stood still by the window. She should have felt happy. She knew she should have felt happy. But what she felt wasn't happiness. It was something heavier and slower, like a massive stone being lifted off her chest while the hollow it had left behind remained. The past did not disappear. The 3 false customs declarations still existed somewhere in the system. Her name was still on those pages. The truth about those 3 in the morning trips to the port of Boston, signing false documents because Wade broke her finger when she refused. That truth did not vanish just because Priya had hidden her name. It had only gone still, waiting. Maren let out a quiet breath, set her phone down on the windowsill, and looked outside. Stefan was standing by the lake. No suit, no gun, his flannel shirt rolled to the elbows, a mug of coffee in one hand, his hair slightly disordered by the wind off the water. He looked different, not completely different. He still had those broad shoulders, still that sharp-cut face, still those cold eyes. But something had shifted, the way a 3-meter concrete wall changes after the wind has worn at it long enough for a thread of light to slip through a crack. Goliath was trotting slowly across the wet grass in front of him, not running with excitement, but moving with the heavy, measured pace of a large dog still healing. 4 sturdy legs pressing into the ground, nose lifting to the scent of lake wind, tail swaying gently. The dog went 10 meters, then stopped, turned, and looked back at Stefan, checking that he was still there. He saw him still standing by the lake, coffee in hand, watching. Goliath turned again, and kept going. Another 10 meters, then stopped, turned back, checking. Still there. Then he moved on again. Maren watched that through the kitchen window, and thought that perhaps this was the closest thing to peace she had ever known. The days that followed moved slowly, like the water of the Vermont lake folding itself against the stone shore. There was no gunfire, no phone vibrating in the middle of the night, no shadow of an unfamiliar car on the forest road. There was only the sound of wind through the pines, the sound of water, the steady breathing of Goliath stretched across the wooden porch, and the sound of Stefan's hammer each morning as he kept repairing the rotted parts of the cabin he had once never thought of as home. On the afternoon of the 3rd day after Jonas and Katrin left, Maren carried 2 cups of tea out to the porch. The sky was clear, the light pale, and the lake looked bluer than it had on any other day because the clouds had fully lifted and the water reflected the sky like a giant mirror. Goliath lay beneath the porch steps, belly turned to the sun, all 4 legs stretched out, the scar on his flank showing through the slate-gray fur like a small map of everything that had happened. Stefan sat on the step, a cup of coffee long gone cold in his hand, his eyes fixed on the lake. Maren set the tea beside him, sat down, and stayed quiet for a while. Then she asked, her voice soft, unhurried, as if this question could have waited another day or another year, and it still would have been all right. "Are you going back to Boston?" Stefan didn't answer at once. He looked at the lake, looked at the ring of pine trees around the water, looked at Goliath lying belly up in the sunlight, breathing evenly, so peaceful he seemed like a completely different dog from the dying creature on the steps of the Beacon Hill mansion that night. Then he looked at Maren, looked at her eyes, warm brown, still holding the shadow of exhaustion but no longer the shadow of fear, looked at the way her thin fingers wrapped around the teacup, the same fingers he had held through an entire endless night while Goliath nearly died, and he said, "I lost a house last week. Maybe I should build a new one before I think about going back." Maren looked at him. "Here?" Stefan didn't answer with words. He gave a low, gentle whistle, a short sound, the kind he didn't know when he had learned. Goliath lifted his head from the grass, ears rising, then rolled up onto his feet with the heavy but eager movement of a large dog who knew the person he had chosen was calling. He trotted toward the porch, mouth open, tail wagging, and stopped in front of Stefan, pressing his wet, heavy muzzle into his palm. Stefan rubbed behind Goliath's ear, naturally, without hesitation, without stiffness. The hand that had held guns, had signed orders, had stayed clenched in his coat pocket for 28 years so no one would ever see it shake, now rubbed behind the ear of a wounded dog beside a quiet lake and looked as though it had done this all its life. Maren watched that and understood. The answer wasn't in what he said. It was in the fact that a man who had sworn to himself at 9 years old that he would never again grow attached to anything fragile, would never again keep anything that could be taken from him, was standing here now, on the porch of a cabin by the lake, stroking the head of a dog he had nearly lost twice, beside the woman for whom he had made tea at 3 a.m, not because anyone asked him to, but because he wanted to. That was the answer. No more words were needed. 1 week passed, then 2. The cabin slowly changed. A new porch, new steps, a new kitchen window frame, because the old one had warped. Every morning Stefan drove into town, and when he came back, the trunk was loaded with lumber, nails, and building supplies. He wasn't building a castle. He was only fixing what was broken, replacing what had rotted, preserving what was still good. The way he was doing with himself. Late that afternoon, sunlight cut across the lake, warm and golden, stretching the pine shadows long across the grass. Maren sat on the newly repaired porch, her back against the post, her legs stretched out, a book in her hands, reading on a porch in the afternoon. The humble life she had once thought impossible she had ever told Stefan about on this very porch, on that quiet afternoon before the night Goliath nearly died, and now it was here, not a dream anymore. Goliath lay on his back in the grass a few steps from the porch, all 4 legs lifted toward the sky, his sagging jowls and soft underbelly in the sun. The scar on his flank healed into a pale line through his slate-gray fur. The dog breathed evenly, eyes closed, completely surrendered in the way only dogs who feel utterly safe can lie on their backs beneath an open sky. Far off on the forest road, the sound of a car drifted toward them. Maren lifted her head from the page. The familiar SUV turned into the drive, Stefan at the wheel, the back loaded with pine boards and sacks of materials. Maren didn't get up to meet him. She only lifted her head, watched the car pull in, watched Stefan through the windshield, then returned to her page, as if he had always been here, as if he had never left. Goliath was different. The dog rolled to his feet, tail wagging, and ran toward the vehicle as it came to a stop, mouth open, his heavy legs moving eagerly over the green grass. Stefan opened the driver's door and stepped out, and Goliath was already there, muzzle pushing into his hand, tail sweeping against his leg, his whole body trembling with happiness. The late sun broke across the lake into a million small pieces of gold. The wind carried the scent of pine and water, and on the porch of a cabin by a Vermont lake, a woman read a book, a dog wagged his tail, and a man brought home lumber to rebuild what he had lost. Not the house, but the reason to have a house. Stefan, Maren, and Goliath's story ends here. But perhaps the lesson it leaves behind does not. That sometimes the thing that heals us isn't power, or money, or victory, but a wounded living creature choosing to trust us when we have forgotten how to trust ourselves. That love is not weakness, no matter who taught us that when we were young. That sometimes the bravest thing is not stepping into the dark with a gun in your hand, but offering the quiet comfort of a steaming mug in the dead of night for someone you have just learned lied to you. And that the smallest dream, something as small as reading on a porch in the afternoon, can sometimes be the very thing worth rebuilding everything from the beginning for. If this story touched you, if you saw yourself or someone you love in Maren, in Stefan, or even in Goliath, please press the like button so I'll know you stayed with me to the very end. Share this video with a friend, a family member, anyone you think might need this story today. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next stories we'll tell you every day. I'd truly love to hear how this story made you feel. Which character reached you the most deeply? Which moment made you stop and think about your own life? Write it in the comments. I'll read every line, because a story is only truly complete when it is heard from both sides. I wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Thank you for being here. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.